First of all, thank you all for being here. I know you have a lot of other things you could be doing, a lot of television shows you could be watching, time with family, time with loved ones, or just being anywhere else, but you chose to be here, so we really appreciate it. There are 4 ballot measures on this November 6th ballot just for the city of Santa Ana. What does that mean? We are a very involved and engaged community. When you look at other cities, not as many communities have 1, 2, 3, but let alone 4 ballot measures. And there's some reasons for that, and we'll go into that. But before I start in the presentation, just by way of reference, I am the assistant to the city manager. Born and raised in the city of Santa Ana. Born on Bristol when it used to be Mercy Hospital. And still live in the city of Santa Ana. So I live in Washington Square with my wife and 2 kids. And before I had childcare drop-off, I used to enjoy an 8-minute walk to work. Now it's a little bit more of a commute with drop-off, but just so you know, I am born and raised here in the city, and being in this library reminds me of memories at a lot of my schools, so it's great to be here. So we'll go ahead and jump in. Just by way of reference, this is an information session. Because the 4 ballot measures are on the ballot, I cannot advocate for or against any of the measures. I am happy to answer any questions. I've only had one question in about the 40 or so of these presentations that we've done that I have been unable to answer because it was very specific and we could not answer that. Other than that, by all means, feel free to ask. Nicole's going to be here to jot down any questions or any follow-up. So if there is something, code enforcement issues, other issues in the neighborhoods that you want us to take a look at, by all means, one of the great things when we've been able to do these is we get a lot of input from the community. So we're here to serve you. Our police department is one of the most visible and active in the community, but remember that you have over 1,200 employees providing service to the community all year round. So ballot measures. We have 4 ballot measures. And I'm going to give you a summary of what those are right now, and then we'll go into some detail. So Measure X is the add-on sales and use tax. Measure Y is the cannabis business license tax. Measure Z is the city charter modernization, and Measure AA is to change how we elect council members in the city of Santa Ana. So we're going to start with Measure Y. Why? Because Measure X has the most questions, so we're going to save that one to the end. We'll get through some of these first ones a little quicker, just to give you some context. By all means, if you have questions as we go through, ask me. These are really meant to be informational for you. So Measure Y is an ordinance that would tax commercial cannabis. So by way of reference, in 2014, the voters of Santa Ana approved Measure BB to allow for and tax medical marijuana sales in the city of Santa Ana. In 2016, the state voters approved Proposition 64 to allow for adult use or recreational cannabis. So when that was approved, it took about a year for the state to figure out all the laws and regulations associated with that. So Santa Ana, along with any other city that wanted to, could tax and could allow for any of the uses for cannabis to start effective January 1st of 2018. Santa Ana decided that it would participate in that, and in order to stay ahead of the curve, one of the things that we did is we allowed for that to happen. But there was a little nuance to that. In order to tax anything in the state of California, we have Prop 218. Prop 218 states that you cannot impose a tax or increase a tax without going to the voters. So there's another law that says that you cannot increase or create a tax if it's not a general election. So we did not have the time to do that. So what we did is we worked with our legal department and we came up with an operating fee agreement. The operating fee agreement is kind of like a tax. It acts very similar, but it's different. It's more closely aligned with a development agreement. So it's tied to land use rather than the business activity. So right now we're collecting that fee, but it really should be a tax, and that's what this does. So you'll see a couple of things on the ballot question here, which is a base square footage tax, and then you'll see a gross receipts tax. We are not double taxing. What we are doing is we learned from Measure BB that if you are a cannabis operator, because there is only a finite amount of licenses, you could obtain a license, obtain a second license, and not do anything with that second license. The voters approved a maximum of 20 licenses. To this day, only 18 opened. Why? Partially because if they hold on to that license and it's not used, it's less competition. So our estimates, our projections on revenue were off because we had 2 dispensaries that never opened. So in order to combat that, we added a base gross square footage. And you'll see a pretty big range, 25 cents to $35. The reason for that is because depending on the type of use is what the range would be. And remember, the voters can only increase a tax. The city council can set a lower rate. So what we're asking for here is the maximum amounts, and the alternative is a gross receipts amount. So if the businesses do exceptionally well, so too should the residents of Santa Ana benefit. So the gross receipts tax would kick in once they exceed the amount of the base tax. And then our revenue projections for the allowable uses, which are cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, retail sales, and testing, is about $8 to $12 million annually, and that would go to fund our public safety, parks, youth, senior services, and other general city services. So it's a general business license tax. So this slide essentially goes through the same thing, but the one thing that I wanted to highlight here is you'll see this last line. Measure Y is expected to generate $11 to $14 million. Well, the last slide you saw just said 8 to 12. Why the difference? The difference is when we created the staff report, we had 3 months worth of sales. Because remember, we started in January. By the time we closed out March, it was end of April, and we had to start the analysis. So at that point, this was the data that we had. The city attorney prepares what's called an impartial analysis. It's part of your voter guide that the County of Orange will send out to you. You actually should be getting that this week. So when you get that, what you'll see is this amount as well. So they had 3 additional months of data. So they were able to look at the estimate and increase it. However, city staff, if this is approved, we would budget a lower amount. Because what we don't want to happen is that we budget $14 million, the actual comes in at $10 million, and now we have to make up that $4 million gap. So that's part of the way that we budget all of our revenues. But in this particular area, especially since it's such a new industry, there hasn't been a brand new industry that has really come out since the internet. And even then, that was kind of gradual in terms of e-commerce. This is something substantial in a short amount of time. We know the industry will evolve, so we want to give ourselves the flexibility of that. A couple points to note. Medical marijuana, this is not applicable to because that was already addressed by the voters in 2014. And then there is no taxation on personal cultivation. In the city of Santa Ana, you can cultivate up to 6 marijuana plants indoors, tax-free, no issues, no regulations, nothing like that. So just something to know.
So excited.
Let's party, Dottie.
Yeah, why not?
Any questions on Measure Y? Yes?
You mentioned that the licenses that were not being utilized, can those be sold like a liquor license?
Any license can.
Okay.
Any license can. Our original Measure BB, allows for it, as well as this potential measure. And the reason for that is we are treating cannabis like any other business. We are regulating it, but we are treating it like any other business in the way that we process the permits, the land use designation, any of the factors. We want to treat it like any other business activity. And because any other business can sell its license, so too can that happen with certain rules, regulations. If a license is sold, they have to go through the extensive background check. It's called the regulatory safety permit. But as long as they meet the conditions, and the conditions for transfer are very similar to an alcohol license.
You commented that the funds that are generated were going to go to specific services from the city, and yet it says it's going to the general fund. So does that not mean that they can use that money for whatever they want and not for the purposes of what the sales of the marijuana
Sure.
taxes were?
Sure, so the items that are listed in the ballot question are here, and will they go to fund these? Yes. So it is not a specific tax in that we don't have specific percentages or dollar amounts attributed to it. If we did, that would be a specific tax. This is a general purpose tax, so as a general revenue tax, the voter threshold for approval is 50% plus one, actually for all of the measures, 50% plus one, simple majority. If we did something like that, it becomes a specific tax, and then you're talking about 66% voter approval. So in this particular case, one of the things that the city council is looking at, the general concept, you may have heard it, is 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. 1/3 for youth services, 1/3 for enforcement, and 1/3 for administrative costs. The reason for that is cannabis has been very expensive to litigate. We have been in millions of dollars worth of litigation since we allowed for cannabis to open up because the industry is so lucrative. And then the other side of it is closing down illegal dispensaries. So you probably are all aware, we had over 120 illegal dispensaries in the city of Santa Ana. I'm happy to report that as of last week, we have 2. 2 out of 122. So we've made great progress, but we want to make sure that we have the mechanism in place to have law enforcement. So right now, we have 4 officers dedicated to enforcement, 2 code enforcement positions, a city attorney position, a planner, and then additional funds go to some of the technology investments and things like that. But it is a general tax. But the city council is looking at how they can segregate those dollars, but that would happen post-approval.
Does that general tax mean, does that fund
General fund.
retirement?
Yes,
So that's gonna fund the police
The pension.
It'll-
and the
it'll fund
fire
any,
and
so-
everybody will fund all the pensions?
it'll fund all labor costs, all of our normal costs.
Okay, so that tax on that should help with the pensions as opposed to maybe the
X.
X tax?
We'll get into it, but so.
1/3,
here's-
1/3, 1/3.
1/3, 1/3, 1/3. But
Uh-huh.
here's what you want to remember. In terms of the city, any city, even the county, well, almost all government, but specifically for the city, because I can speak to that, it's a part of our normal cost. So for us, we don't create widgets. We don't have a lot of steel that we buy in order to create a good that is ultimately sold. We provide services, service delivery, our law enforcement. Yes, we provide them the guns, the belts, the shoes, the vehicles in order to go do law enforcement, but that is a very small cost relative to the police department's total budget. So we have labor, and part of our normal labor costs do include salaries, do include pensions, do include our overall benefits. Absolutely, and we do need to be competitive, but it's really up to the city council ultimately. It is part of collective bargaining, but ultimately, all of those contracts are approved by the city council. You got a follow-up question?
The finances and related to that, you say 11 to 14 million dollars. Will that in fact be a positive to the city?
Yes.
Or will it, I'd like to see the study on that, because I'll be willing to bet that the other social costs, the truancy costs, all of the other things that we're currently fighting in the neighborhood, drug use in the streets and the parks, and if that were fully contained, I doubt that your $14 million is going to contain it, especially considering the overall police budget and the deficits and the pensions and all the rest of it, and they're making $250,000 a year plus or minus on average, including pensions. It doesn't take very many officers to eat up $14 million.
That's fair. So what you're talking about really is a philosophical conversation rather than a direct labor cost. And let me answer why. The reason is drug use happens now, whether it's cannabis, whether it's opioids, whether it's anything else. So those costs are associated. But you have to remember what the city of Santa Ana is responsible for and what is within our wheelhouse. Health and social services is a county matter. There are other things that other jurisdictions are responsible for and not necessarily the city of Santa Ana. So When we look at it from a revenue expenditure side, it's a net positive to the city of Santa Ana. If you are trying to have a philosophical conversation in terms of its total cost, societal cost, yeah, there's no program that ever funds itself 100%.
I'm talking about actual costs to the city, not necessarily the direct, but the indirect also that we are absorbing. And we're certainly absorbing a boatload of costs associated with all of the mental health and the drugs and the homeless and all the rest of it. And that is not being done by the county. The county has already said, hey, Anaheim, Fullerton, Santa Ana, you're on your own. They took off and hid in South County. Okay, and despite what Judge Carter is trying to do, okay, we got a rough road to hoe, and I don't think that $14 million is going to cover it.
That's the information that we're providing. The conversation that you're trying to have, I can have in a different forum, but for this, just to keep this about the information and the measure, I'd like to move on a little bit, but I'm more than happy at the end of the meeting to have a more thorough conversation on it. One, because I oversee the cannabis program, so I have some of the information and I can give you all of the stats that we have behind that. Any other questions on Measure Y? Okay. So Measure Z, the City Charter Modernization and Update of Administrative Provisions. So you may or may not know that the City of Santa Ana is what's called a charter city. There are two types of incorporations that cities have. They can either incorporate as a charter city or as a general law city. A city charter is essentially a local constitution. It's how we incorporate, it's what gives us the powers and authorities for the city council, powers and authority for the city manager, the fact that we have a council manager form of government, and the overall authority of the city is vested within the city charter. Anything that is not directly attributed in the city charter, you default to government code. So in this particular case, you get the best of both worlds. The city charter was adopted in 1952 and last comprehensively updated in 1967. From time to time, it's been updated, term limits, sunshine ordinances, a couple of different things have happened that have updated it since then, but in a comprehensive way in 1967. So how we operate government today is fundamentally different than 1967. So what we're looking to do is every election cycle, we're gonna come and present modernization options. And the reason is we can no longer do comprehensive updates. A lot of cities that were charter cities tried to do overwhelming changes and updates, and they would sneak things in. And then the voters later would say, hey, we didn't agree to that. We didn't know that that was embedded in the city charter. So state law was passed that prohibits cities from doing that. So now it has to be, if you're going to bundle things, they have to be very limited purpose and very similar in nature. So that's what we're doing here with 3 cleanup items. And as I mentioned, every 2 years, we're gonna bring some items up to the voters to get their input and authorization. Because a city charter can only be changed by the voters. Cannot be changed by the city council, cannot be changed by staff. Requires voter approval. That's why it's a local constitution. That's the difference. So the 3 things that we're looking to update is conflicts with the city and state law on gifts and campaign contributions, consistency with the municipal code on boards and commissions, and then the position and qualifications for finance director. And this really explains what the charter city is. So those 3 items. So the first one that I'll get into is the appointed boards and commissions. So we have a planning commission, we have a personnel board. Those descriptions are vested in the city charter. And at the time, that was very appropriate in the 50s and 60s. But now, the way we operate government, we'd like to move those provisions to be consistent with the other boards and commissions that exist, the Parks and Recreation Commission, the Arts Commission, and put those in the municipal code, where the city council can, from time to time, evaluate the qualifications, evaluate the powers, duties, and responsibilities, and make changes. Still with a public process, require public hearings and a 30-day wait period, but to move those into the municipal code. In terms of the gift limits and campaign contributions, right now there's a conflict, and there's inconsistencies between what our charter says and what government code says. And it's gotten some people in some unfair legal trouble. The reason being, the city's charter says you cannot make a campaign contribution of over $249. So anyone running for city council, for a person, an individual wanting to make that contribution, $249 is your limit. But state law allows it to be up to $1,000. But there's different reporting requirements. So someone could make a campaign contribution for someone in the city of Santa Ana and find themselves in some awkward legal situations, because ultimately it's up to the person that makes the contribution to know the regulations. So what we want to do, the proposal is, move it out of the charter, put it into the municipal code, reference the state law, and then the city council can keep it at $249 or have it anywhere in between 0, or well, actually 1 and 1,000. So it would be simply to take it out of the charter, put it into the municipal code, so that ultimately the city council can make those adjustments from time to time as the community sees fit. Then the third is the position of the finance director. So the finance director is the only position in the executive management team that is still in the city charter. So it's more appropriate for it to be in the municipal code. How we do budgets, how we do finances in the 60s and today are very different. So we want to do the same thing. We want to update it, move it into the municipal code, and so that as things change from time to time, so too can the positions, qualifications also evolve. Any questions on Measure Z? This one's the most straightforward, and we usually get the least amount of questions on this one.
Understandably.
Measure AA. So this one is one that has a little bit of a history to it. So right now, when the voters of Santa Ana select their candidates to be council members, they must live in the ward that they represent, but are voted by the entire city. And then we have the ward maps that outline where that happens. The proposal here would be to make it a requirement that a council member has to live, be nominated by, and be elected by solely the people in which they represent. This would not impact the position of the mayor, would still be voted at large, and this would not impact term limits. Those provisions are already in the city charter, and the voters have made adjustments to those since about the year 2000. I think it's been updated twice, first for the council and then for the mayor's position. So this is our current ward map. So in the part of the reason that this is coming up is the city of Santa Ana received a lawsuit. There was an allegation that the city was disenfranchising the Asian American population in the city that's on the west side, on the other side of the riverbed. The allegation was that because they were split up into 3 wards, that there was a violation of what's called the California Voter Rights Act, CVRA. So that act essentially says that you have to be able to have ward boundaries that allow you to have, if you're enough of the population, to be able to vote someone of your similar racial background into elected office. So this really created 2 concerns here for the city, and ultimately why the city entered into a tentative settlement agreement. The first is to ask the question on changing the type of voting structure, and then the second is to do the ward maps. So the allegation was that this area is divided into 3 wards. So just changing the voting system would not be sufficient. We would have to redraw the maps. So redrawing districts is something that the city has done before, and it's in the city charter. There's procedures, guidelines for how that happens. So that's already in the city charter. So we're not asking to change those provisions. In fact, part of the tentative settlement agreement says that we actually need to start the ward redrawing process now, which we are in the middle of. So there's a requirement for 5 public hearings. We've had 2. There'll be 3 more public hearings. The next one will be Tuesday at the next council meeting. The following council meeting on the 16th, October 16th, in order to get additional public input. So if you go to the city's website, you can look at 4 draft maps that a consultant has put together, and then you can provide your input. Do you like one or another? Do you want neighborhood associations to stay together? Do you want school boundaries to be a factor? What is it that you are looking to have in your ward map process? So those are things that we're getting input on right now. So that's happening concurrently.
Why is it you can't just make that one section a new ward, Ward 7? Would that be easier?
That would require a charter change. And what would happen is if you only add one additional seat, you're now going to have an even number of council members.
Yeah.
Because the mayor is a voting member.
Yeah.
And in California, and specifically in Santa Ana, the mayor votes on everything. It's not, in some branches of government, the executive or the figurehead, the mayor, or at the Senate, the vice president comes in and votes only if there's a tie break. That's not how we govern. So you need to have an odd number.
I see that, yeah.
So it require a charter change, and that's more difficult to do. So that's the rationale behind why this measure is there. So context, we're not the only city. Part of it is the CVRA has resulted in lawsuits up and down the state of California, primarily by one attorney, now a second, has gotten into the game. So every city that has gotten sued and has tried to defend itself has lost. And it's cost millions of dollars in legal fees and then subsequent settlements. And they still have to end up changing their voting system.
Welcome to California.
So some cities, if they're a general law city, or if they're a charter city, and their charter is silent on how they elect council members, could make that change by ordinance. City of Costa Mesa, for example, did that. But some cities require a vote of the people. Here, it requires a vote of the people. But other cities, like I said, have done it. Lake Forest also has this same measure, or same type of measure. It's called something else in Lake Forest, to do essentially the exact same thing.
Okay, hold on, before XX.
Yes.
I mean, before X. We have to be out of here by 8:30. We're gonna do lotto, not lotto, the
A lot of questions.
the raffle at 8:25 on the dot. So we have to be out of here by
Perfect.
8:30. So just fair
I'll
warning.
speed through these as quickly as possible. And then I know we'll have to leave, but I'm more than happy to stick around outside the fence wall so that we don't make any issues. So more than happy to do that.
Okay.
So Measure X, and I'll go through these a little quickly. But this is the official ballot question. You do have the presentation, so I'll go through this a little quicker so that we can save time for questions. So the question here before the voters is, shall we essentially put a sales and use tax for a 10-year period at 1 1/2 cents, and then after 10 years, have it drop to 1 cent for an additional 10 years to provide law enforcement, address homelessness, fix parks, and general city services. So it is a general revenue tax. It is not a specific tax. So the dollar amounts that we're talking about is for the first 10 years, $60 million annually, and then for the second 10 years, $40 million annually. So context. I think that's the one thing that we want to provide you in terms of information is context. Is that a lot? Is that a little? $60 million is a big number, but we need some context in order to make sure we understand what these numbers mean. Right now, Santa Ana receives about $47.9 million in sales tax annually. So the interesting thing here is not all of the sales tax that you pay comes to the city of Santa Ana. Most of it actually goes to the state, county. We only get 1 cent of it. So some context. What are other cities of similar size to Santa Ana? What are their sales tax rates? So Long Beach is at 10 1/4, Oakland 9 1/4, Riverside 8.75, San Bernardino 8%. Interesting thing about Riverside, they just approved it 4 years ago. They're actually going back to their voters for an additional 1/2 cent because they didn't receive enough revenue. So if approved for phase 1, which is the first 10-year period, it'd be an increase, and our rate would be 9 1/4, and then it'd drop in phase 2 to 8.75. So are we alone in this? No. There's other cities that currently have a sales and use tax in Orange County, Fountain Valley, Stanton, La Habra, Westminster, La Palma. And then other cities that are taking a sales tax this November alongside Santa Ana are Garden Grove, Placentia, Seal Beach, Laguna Beach. And there's reasons for that, and that's what we want to get into. But this is what this looks like. So this is your existing sales tax breakdown. What we're looking to do with the measure is add 1.5 cents. That all stays local, and that's the difference. Sacramento can't touch it, Washington DC can't touch it, the county can't touch it. It's all for Santa Ana, so all of those dollars stay local, stay here. In phase 2, the amount does go down, but same thing, it all stays here. This is not a substitute. One of the questions that we get is, oh, does that mean the state gets less? No, this is an add-on to it. So that's what's important to note there. So how do we currently spend our budget? Hopefully you are all aware that we spend the lion's share of our budget on public safety, police, fire, and ambulance services. 70% of our total budget goes to that. 70%. So when you look at that, that's really police and fire. 30% goes to all other city services. Code enforcement, parks, recreation, legal costs, everything else, 30% of the budget. General fund. Context, our general fund budget is $255 million a year. So that gives you a little bit of context in terms of 60 million compared to what? 48 million compared to what? It gives you a sense of size and scale.
You want to save questions?
If we can, that way I can
Okay.
just go through these, because
Okay.
some of your questions I may answer.
Okay, well, probably not, but go ahead.
Okay, so here is probably one of the more important slides, because we get asked, why do you need additional revenue? And part of that is you have to look at all the revenue that the city receives. The lion's share of what cities receive in terms of revenue in most cities is property tax. It's stable, it's consistent, it doesn't really change, most of the time because of Prop 13. So what does this mean? Context. Property value results in property tax that the city receives, but it's based on valuation. So the total valuation in the city of Santa Ana is $26.5 billion. Is that a lot? Is that a little? Let's add some context to that. City of Irvine, $78.4 billion. Let's add a little more context to that. They serve 100,000 fewer people than we do. Okay, let's make a comparison to a city that's similar in size to us, Anaheim. Their valuation is $20 billion higher than us. Okay, let's look at a city whose valuation is closer to ours, Orange. 21.6 billion, so about $5 billion less in valuation, but we serve 200,000 more people. So what makes up this valuation? Valuation is based on assessed values. So homes, for example, homes make up a small part of this valuation. And when I say a small part, the reason is homes are assessed based on comparable sales and market sales. That's how homes are assessed their value. Prop 13 put a cap on that. So when it was approved in the 70s, it froze rates with a small escalator, but it froze them. So what we have is a home today that may be worth $500,000 on the market value. Its assessed value is much less. If in the 70s it was worth $50,000, its assessed value today is probably somewhere in about the $120,000 range. So what does that mean? That the person who's paying property tax, who's been in the home since the 70s, is paying about $1,200 a month. $1,200 a year in property tax. The person next door who just bought the home is probably paying $5,000 a year. About 4 times as much. But they receive all the same city services. So you can start to see some of the disparity and why there's some of the need associated with this. The other thing is how you actually get to this value. So one of the things that most people don't know is the lion's share of this comes from commercial and industrial property. So I'll give you an example. The city of Santa Ana, addressing homelessness, working with the county, we're looking to acquire a 2-acre site to build a homeless shelter. Its value, $12 million for the land and the building that's on it. Ballpark. If we were to build single-family homes on that same piece of property, we'd be able to maybe have 8 homes on it at $500,000, $4 million in total assessed value versus $12 million. Why? Because commercial and industrial is based partially on land value, but primarily on gross receipts and a portion of the profitability of a business. So it's a different way to structure it. And because a community like Irvine exploded in the 80s and 90s, post Prop 13, that's part of it. The other thing that you have here is where are your costs generated? Because that gives you an explanation of revenue, but your cost. Do industrial and commercial centers need schools? No. Do they need community centers? No. Do they need parks and recreation? No. It's the residents that need those services, but the residents, remember, don't generate as much of the revenue. So it starts to give you a little bit of a picture as to some of the complexity as to why we would need additional revenue. Because the residents in a densely populated city like Santa Ana, fourth most densely populated city in the country, is going to have some of these issues. Of course, it's also not a secret. We're facing a budget shortfall. $8.1 million last year, 17.1 this year, 31.2 projected next year. Now we are making steps to get those numbers down. That 17.1 for this fiscal year, we've already gotten that down to 10.2. We're making additional cuts and adjustments in order to further hit that number, but there's only so much that you can cut. And the reason is we've already cut over 500 positions since the Great Recession. We contracted out the fire department, contracted out maintenance, utility user tax, and we had to reduce services in different areas. So context, when we look at it, we now have less than 1,000 full-time employees. 990 is our last count. When you factor in part-time employees, the full-time equivalent is about 1,220. So context, how does that compare to other cities? Other cities of our size, Riverside and Anaheim, for every city employee, they serve 130 residents. 130, 134. Santa Ana, double that, 266. We are lean, mean, and as efficient as we can be. So you can't cut your way out of a budget issue. So one of the things that we like to illustrate here is you have some of the best city employees anywhere. Your city employees are well-trained, well-educated, and well-respected in the industry. I challenge the city of Anaheim or Riverside to cut half its staff and do the things that we're able to do in Santa Ana. So of course, we will have some additional dollars and we're gonna have to make some investments, right? Homelessness is of course an issue. Our response times, and we'll get into one of the things that you made a comment about earlier with our officers, and then fixing and maintaining streets and parks. Homelessness, I don't know if you guys realize this, the city of Santa Ana spent $17.4 million on homelessness last year. 17.4. So when you look at some of those budget shortfalls, you can see how homelessness is impacting our budget. Because these are city services that you're not getting. When our officers are addressing homelessness issues, they're not going to provide services to our residents. Call times are less because they have to address priority phone calls. When we look at our police officers, so why does it take so long for someone to come to take an incident report? Western States Police Officers Association says how many officers per 1,000 residents you should have. The ratio is 1.8. We have 0.9. We have 326 sworn officers right now. If we use that ratio, we should be closer to 700. So the officer was correct. We do have 70 vacant positions. But really, we have about 400 vacant positions when you look at where we should be. So context, City of Anaheim, they are at 1.8. City of Pasadena, 1.7. City of Ontario, 1.8. Other communities do it. Will we get there overnight? No. You make a great point. We've been hiring a lot of officers, but we have retirements on the back end. So it's a game of catch up. We need to do more. We have been doing a lot. Our police chief has been doing a lot of good things. He's actually put in, for the first time, we have a dedicated officer who all that person does is go out and recruit more officers. Whether that's lateral officers from other agencies, police recruits, going out to the different colleges and universities in order to get more resources. And then of course, we know our roads and parks need work. We're 7 times the national average in terms of where we should be on park space. And for our streets, we should be spending about $3.5 to $10 million a year to maintain the streets. Right now we spend $200,000. Not everything is applicable to sales tax. Groceries, rent, mortgage, leases are all exempt from sales tax. as well as these other items. But important to note, on groceries, that's the one question that we get. Well, I just went to Trader Joe's or Albertsons and I saw it on the bottom of my bill. Well, if you buy chicken that's raw, you don't pay sales tax. If you buy a rotisserie chicken, you pay sales tax because it's been heated or prepared. So that's the differentiating factor. And of course, we did add 3 oversight protections. So a Citizens Oversight Committee, we're working with UCI School of Public Policy to find models that would work best in Santa Ana. We're going to require audits on both the revenue and expense side, and then we're going to have an online portal so that you can keep City Hall accountable 24/7. You'll be able to go onto our website and see all of the expenditures for everything that we spend. So that'll be something that you'll have.
If it passes.
Correct. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And with that, this is a specific phone number and email address for any questions that you have. And I'm here to answer any questions for the most part. Go ahead, Connie.
Okay, you had mentioned 70% going toward public safety. Does that also include pensions, retirement?
Yes, fully burdened.
Okay, what percentage of that is retirement and pensions?
So I can tell you that 17% of the city's total budget, general fund only, 17% of the general fund budget goes towards pension payments.
That's pretty big.
So here's another component of it. So city puts in its employer share and cities put in their employee share. So on the miscellaneous side, miscellaneous is anything that's not law enforcement. They pay right now 8% of their salary costs towards pensions. Public safety pays 12%. Their pension rates are much higher, more generous, and they can retire earlier. So that factors into those.
If they
those
change
amounts.
that would help, right?
Correct. Yeah,
But
because
of the union,
PERS
they can't, right?
No, they can. It's
Really?
just something that needs to be negotiated. So just so everyone knows, pensions, the CalPERS system, there are 3 things that make up pension costs. The agency portion, the employee portion, and then rate of return. So they make investments, but remember that the PERS agency, CalPERS, has a fiduciary responsibility to their members, not to the agencies. So just to give you a little bit of context. Other questions? Yes?
When you showed the statistics of the amount of money that the other cities have,
Mm-hmm.
I cannot, in my head, grasp why a city as poor as ours has to carry all of the burden of $17 million for homeless when they have the amount of money that they do. I don't care if you're talking about homes or industrial. You can put a property on, I don't understand, and I don't understand what, it just, I'm sorry.
So
I don't get it. I don't
I-
get it, and I don't know why you're not totally reimbursed, unless we are gonna be reimbursed, and why I know that the people have been fighting the 700-bed unit that is gonna, they had proposed to put down the street from here. That's a lot of responsibility for all of us to burden. I don't know why the fight has not gone through them. I don't get it.
So-
So somebody's lacking on
Sure.
something.
So 2 things. The first is, you have to remember, cities are not responsible for health and human services. That's a responsibility of the County of Orange. And there's a lot of reasons there. So that's one of the things to remember. So can we get reimbursement? It's going to be very difficult, but we're making inroads. So just so you know, we are in the middle of a federal lawsuit addressing homelessness and those various issues. And part of that is the city council did authorize us to sue every city in the county, including the
I was
county
there for
of
that
Orange.
meeting, but I never hear anything else coming back from it. And the only thing I hear, I don't mind helping,
Sure.
but that's, and you understand it, when you're
Absolutely.
talking budgets, and you're talking as poor as we are, with the services we don't have, with the roads we don't have, with all of the landscaping that's gone, all of our trees are dying. I leave every single city, our sister city, as soon as you enter our city, you know you're in Santa Ana. because it is deteriorating. So I understand the whole idea of asking for more money, but on the other thing, you said something that actually I'm offended by, because I am on Prop 13, and I have lived in my home for 40 years, and I have stayed in Santa Ana for that purpose. Just because my house is now worth a lot of money, that's not my problem. And I know that there's a lot of people in here who own properties or on Prop 13. You cannot expect people at our ages to come in now when your home is valued at $600,000, $700,000, $800,000.
Absolutely.
And expect us on retirement pay to pay the property taxes for those types of things. And I know that they're looking at that through the district. I know you're looking at this, and this hits the mainstream. This hits everybody. But I kind of took offense
Sure.
a little bit on the way
So
you
let
were
me
doing that.
let me first say I apologize. It was
No,
those
I'm
statements
just-
were not made to be offensive, and I will tell you that the city is not proposing to make any changes to Prop 13.
They can't.
We provide
They
it
can't.
simply as a data set. You're right. Now the state has attempted. Different governors have attempted over time. Prop 13 is not something, especially on the residential side, that will probably ever change. There are some provisions, some folks that want to look things at the commercial side, because part of it is if you transfer a commercial property and you vest 5% ownership into whoever you're selling it to, they get to keep the Prop 13 value, and then the next day what they can do is they can sell that 5% back to whoever they got it from, and those properties, although for all intents and purposes they exchanged hands, because of some clever loopholes, the valuation stays the same.
Does that happen with rental properties, people who are renting, or just commercial?
Commercial, that's commercial
Okay.
industrial.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
multifamily
wasn't-
has a different provision in it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But no, so it was not meant to offend, and by all means, I mean, I'm a property owner in the city, I get the valuation, I get those challenges. But it's part of the reality as a city organization on how we deliver services. Yes,
I put a big portion of this whole issue squarely at the feet of the council and the mayor. They pissed away $13 million at the jail fiasco. They're giving $1 million to a car dealership. Okay, they just gave carte blanche raises to everybody, even though the police are making $250,000 a year. Okay, with $1 million pensions that none of us can get. I don't see how you can ask a city whose mean income is $53,000 to then take another $850 a year out of their food and rent budget. I don't see how this council can piss off the Board of Supervisors to the point that we're filing lawsuits against everybody else, instead of working with them to get a portion of that $250 million that they've got sitting in their war chest that is earmarked specifically for homeless and mental health drug issues. How we can have a zoned area in county property adjacent to Irvine for homeless and allow them to dictate that Irvine's not going to have that in their backyard. But they can shovel everything over into us in Santa Ana, specifically starting at the Santa Ana riverbed and at the downtown, the courthouse area. So I would put it on the city council, whoever's there in a couple of months, and the ones that are there now, to get down on their knees and beg the Board of Supervisors do whatever they've got to do to help clean this up. Because it certainly wasn't the South County people that did this. We did this to ourselves.
I appreciate the comments and the feedback, and by all means, this is really, for us as staff, we're impartial. For us, if this does not pass, we're okay with that. If it passes, we're okay with that, and let me tell you why. The reason is, we are here to administer the city's budget, whatever budget amount that is. So if this is not approved, then what the city manager will do is he will evaluate the city services and present the city council a balanced budget. Because remember, cities, unlike the state or federal government, have to pass a balanced budget every year. It's a law. they cannot go out and issue debt and do different things that the state or the federal government can. So if this is not approved, then the city manager will look at service delivery in the city and make changes accordingly. But know that city services would need to be impacted. It's a simple revenue and expenditure, those lines cross, and that's what we'd have to look at.
Where's the plan B from this council? They took a look at one thing and said, oh, this'll do it. And how many of them are termed out, so they walk away and just leave this pile of crap for us to clean up? I mean, you've got their ear, you're in the meetings, we're not, they won't listen to us. Where's the plan B? Somebody's gotta be working on a plan B there.
We are working on a plan B. I can tell you, we are working on a plan B.
Share it with us.
Unfortunately,
But that would
at this
torpedo
point, we
this.
can't. No, and let me tell you why. The city manager was very specific. One, once a city puts a ballot measure on, there's very few things that we can do. We're very constrained in what we can do. But the city manager's direction, when we put together this presentation, was to not use scare tactics. We did not want to tell residents, well, we're gonna have to cut this, do that, if this isn't approved. Instead, the presentation that was provided is to provide context and information, and ultimately for the voters to tell the city, what level of service do you want from your government? And depending on what that answer is on November 6th, staff will present to the city council adjustments. And then from there, ultimately, it's up to the city council, to your point, on what is approved and what is not approved.
We're not stupid, give us the options. You've given us one option. You gave us one option on the ward. Okay, and that's disingenuous. Because you say that you gotta use a charter change to go ahead and do it. But you've got a charter change facing us right here anyway. You've got a census
there's
coming
two.
up, you've got a census coming up in 2 years.
That's correct.
So we're gonna turn around and gerrymander all the districts, the wards all over again. What's the point of that? If this were a business, we would have been bankrupt decades ago. But because it's taxpayer money, okay, and they don't actually have to perform, we end up holding the bag again.
It's a fair point. I hear what you're saying. I hear
If my house was a
you.
mile that way in Irvine or a mile that way in Costa Mesa, it would be worth considerably more. But because it's got a Santa Ana address,
Yep, zip code.
Yeah.
in the toilet.
That, he can't help this, in all
He's
honesty.
getting the brunt of it.
It's fair. I understand your
You live in
perspective and
Santa
where
Ana
you're
too,
coming
you
from.
know, you
Born
are,
and raised. I live in the city. I live in Washington
this is your
Square.
job, but you are definitely experiencing the same things that we're experiencing.
Sure,
You
and
know.
I think one of the
You
things
know.
that and the reason that I share that I am a resident,
Yeah.
lifelong resident,
Yes.
and decided to invest in the city is not to persuade you in any direction.
We're late.
It's simply because I have to wear two hats. As a resident, I wear a different hat. But when I'm at work, you, the residents of Santa Ana, hired me via the city council and city manager to provide you unbiased information. How I feel about any of the measures is irrelevant when I'm here in this capacity.
Correct, well, yes.
It's not personal.
No.
But you know stuff
I get
that we
it.
don't, okay, so I hope you pick it
And
up the
part
food chain.
of our responsibility is to make sure that I follow chain of command. And in addition to that, to make sure that we release information when it's appropriate. But I hear you.
Can I add something to another way of
Yeah.
revenue, if you've
Sure.
ever thought of this? Irma and I go around, and she does, Connie does too, once a month or once in a while, and take all these signs down off the poles, off the trees, off the medians, off the whatever, you know, the cash for junk cars, this place for
Yep.
sale, this
Not
real
political
estate, blah, blah, blah.
signs, we leave those alone.
Well, right now, yes, of course, no, but you know, all the ones that make our town look terrible.
Sure.
Okay, they used to have, and I get after Sergio and Alvaro all the time, they're code enforcement. Why are you not enforcing those? Why is the city not enforcing those? It's supposed to be
Staffing
$100,
issue.
$100 a fine for each posting. We just took down about 50-some today among our work.
Sure.
And so why, that's not being followed through, and
So
that should be by the city.
partially it's a staffing issue, I can tell you that. And partially it's a lot of these phone numbers
We
are
have lots.
registered No, I get that we have volunteers, but you have to remember, a lot of these numbers are registered mobile phones that are throwaway phones.
Burner phones.
They're burner phones, exactly.
So how do they expect
how do
people
you
to call them back?
enforce- No, they'll receive a phone call,
Yeah.
but how do we cite? How do we enforce?
Some of them have addresses on them, believe it or
Fair
not.
enough. I'm not saying that it's all of them,
No.
but the vast majority, it's a phone number where we can't do enforcement, where we'd have to spend a considerable amount of time, effort, and money
Mm-hmm.
that would make these things go higher. So it's a cat and mouse game.
So we
It
can
is, it's a
see,
game.
keep
But we
tearing
have
them
looked,
down.
we have looked into
I
that.
I do too.
Yeah, good.
The same thing with the Airbnbs, why we can't get them to pay business taxes and TOT.
Partially, there's been a lot of lawsuits. A lot of cities have been sued over the shared economy and how do you properly tax a shared economy. It's an interesting dynamic.
We've got a
We'll figure
bed
it out.
tax, it's on the books.
Yeah.
Why are they exempt, and they can do it in an R1 zone in my neighborhood and have 15 cars parked all over the place because they've got every room, including the bathroom, rented out?
And that's part of the challenge.
Okay, well, I know there's probably lots of other questions, but we have to get out of here. Jorge, can you draw our